Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and personalities through a generational lens. I am Professor James Davenport. This is my colleague, Dr. Emily Stacy, and today we are going to be talking about cancel culture.
Have you been canceled?
I don't think so.
Sorry.
I don't think I've been canceled yet, but you never know, right? So the New York Times had an op-ed a few weeks back.
Yes, sir.
Decrying cancel culture. We've seen this talked about in various other media and platforms, people concerned about it. And we thought this might be a good time for us to kind of weigh in on our thoughts on it. And I will tell you, the first thing that comes to my mind is that there's not really any solid definition of what is meant by cancel culture, right?
It's kind of like pornography or obscenity. You know it when you see it.
Exactly.
And usually it's whenever it hurts my feelings or it triggers me.
Yes, it makes me upset about something. Yes. Pew Research Center, I love them. They do a ton of public opinion research on all sorts of things. They did a poll in 2020 asking Americans about cancel culture specifically. Only about 44% of the respondents said that they were even familiar, at least a fair amount, of what cancel culture was. So not even a majority actually understood what was meant by that. Now, obviously, and I think we'll get into this, given that cancel culture is very much tied in with social media,
Very much so.
Younger age groups were more familiar with the concept, right? Interestingly enough, there wasn't that much difference between Republicans and Democrats regarding the familiarity of it, right? Now, there were differences in how they perceived what it was, but just being familiar with it, there wasn't any, right? Now, out of that 44% that said that they were somewhat familiar, at least, with this, there were three definitions that kind of arose to the top or stood out, right? The one held by more than anyone, not a majority, but almost, right? 49% of that 44% said that cancel culture were actions taken to hold others accountable. Okay, that's what they identified it as, right? Another 14% said that it amounted to censorship of speech or history. And another 12% said that it was mean-spirited actions taken to cause others harm. So those were the rest of the definitions that were offered were all in the single digits, and so I didn't pull them out. So there is this kind of disagreement about what cancel culture is, and B, whether it's positive or negative, right? As I mentioned, it is very much a social media phenomenon. And so they asked people what was the effect of calling people out on social media when they post, and I want to get this right, they post potentially offensive content on social media. 58% of their respondents said that calling people out for potentially offensive content holds them accountable for their actions. In that, 75 Democrats agreed with that. 38% said that cancel culture is likely to punish people who don't deserve it, and 56% of Republicans agreed with that. So there you start seeing some difference in how Republicans and Democrats view this. In a separate study, which I found interesting, Pew also found that 57% of Americans believe that people are too easily offended by what others say, right? And so I'm trying to figure out, now this wasn't the same study that they did with that one, but I'm trying to figure out that there's a little bit of disconnect, right? We're going to hold people accountable, but these other people are too sensitive, and so there's, as you can see, it gets blurry real quickly, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think, I have my own concerns about cancel culture per se, but I also have my own kind of thought out definition of what I think it is, right? And I think I've seen some people write about this, and I think they refer to the first person or first speaker bias that oftentimes people who are upset about cancel culture have. In other words, you say something, what you say is mean-spirited or offensive in some way, a large group of people call you out for that and respond very forcefully.
Sure.
And then you and or your defenders want to say, wait, that's just their free speech, and now you're trying to... And so I think, to me, genuine criticism of what people say is what makes free speech important. It's why we need to have it.
Sure.
And it is not canceling people to say, you said something stupid or offensive or inaccurate, and we're going to call you out on that. That, to me, is not canceling anybody.
Right. And I want to make sure, because we're really focusing on the digital side of cancel culture, and you mentioned specifically that came out in 2020, and I wonder when in 2020 it came out, because really you started to see the emergence of cancel culture in the population whenever the George Floyd protests and riots started to come out. And so cancel culture in other connotations is also sort of the punishing of behavior in a physical sense. So we started to see a lot of folks, making spurious phone calls to the police over racially motivated or minorities hanging out or whatever it might be, and those people being targeted specifically on social media, right? So it was happening in the physical, real world, but then those folks were being inundated, right? Being completely investigated, really, on these social media platforms. And in some of those cases, cancel culture, as you mentioned, was legitimately cancel culture, losing jobs, losing income, losing, all kinds of reputation, etc. So,
I want to. A lot of my friends on the right tend to think of cancel culture as only being a left-wing activist type of thing. I'm going to just point to a couple of specific episodes that I think are exhibits of right-wing cancel culture. And one is one that a lot of people probably are familiar with, which is the Colin Kaepernick situation, right? Here you have an African-American athlete, member of the NFL, who was concerned, and I think he expressed concern about this before the George Floyd episode. I'm getting my mouth is not working properly today. Before all of that occurred, right? So he was out there ahead of this, saying that and expressed that his concern by simply kneeling during the national anthem at football games. And I saw a bunch of conservatives lose their ever-loving minds over this. And wanted him run out of the NFL, wanted any other player that did the same thing run out of the NFL, and made it clear that was, well, guess what? To me, that is more of a canceling than anybody criticizing some conservative talk show host or something about something they said, right? Here you're starting to cost someone their job for the basis that you don't like an expression that they utter.
I mean, that's what the First Amendment is. It's to protect unpopular protest, right? Or unpopular opinions. It's a dangerous, slippery slope that we are on.
And that's the thing that, the First Amendment protects us from government punishment for things that we utter. It does not protect us from private or societal repercussions, right? And this is where I think you do get into some blurry lines. I can, if I say something, let's say I own a business and I say something that offends a large people in the community, and they make it known that I've offended them and that they're not going to shop, and they're going to encourage other people not to shop at my store. Is that canceling me? I don't know that is. They have a perfect right not to come to my store. I can't force them to come to my store, right? And so they have the right of association of choosing where they're going to transact business. And so to me, that type of thing is a little bit different than going after someone for their job. Another example I'll point out coming from the right wing is Turning Point USA's list of 2 liberal professors. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but they encourage students from across the country to put names on this list of professors who apparently are indoctrinating them in liberalism or progressivism or whatever the term of the day is, Marxism, And so that is purely a form of intimidation.
Absolutely.
And I think, to me, that's what I'm most concerned about in this. And I think, I will say two things. Number one, I think that is much less frequent than what is normally happening, which is just people are reacting to something that they heard and they're saying, I don't like that, which is very common, and I have no problem with that. I think it can get mean-spirited. I think we're either today, probably today a little bit, we're going to talk about Jonathan Haidt's new article coming out in the Atlantic, talking about how social media has created this kind of environment that incites us to do this. Before we get to that, I do want to talk about, because what I'm immediately most concerned about, I'm concerned about this other stuff too, but what I'm most concerned about is what happens in a college setting, what happens on college campuses. Right. And we've heard a lot about how students are or are not reluctant to speak out on issues, to either in a classroom setting or in other settings on a campus. The Heterodox Academy conducts an annual campus expression survey where they ask students, how likely are you to speak on a controversial topic in class, right? And for 2021, 60% of the respondents said that they were reluctant to discuss at least one controversial subject on campus, and they gave them a list of like 5 subjects that they really honed in on. So I think race, religion, sexual orientation and gender, and politics were the 5, and then there was a specific question about, or a set of questions about COVID-19 that they asked as well. Interestingly enough, students who did not have the opportunity to interact with their classmates were much more reluctant to engage in conversations over it. So students who don't feel comfortable with their classmates aren't going to talk to them very much, right?
I mean,
That's not rocket science. I've walked into many places where I didn't know anybody, and guess what? I wasn't super talkative, right? And so, and they mentioned this in the report, maybe one of the things that professors can do to facilitate engagement is to have activities where those students get to know each other a little bit better before you start talking about some of these things, right? What class activities or whatnot.
Yeah, I think this particular part obviously concerns us because we're political science professors, and I mean everything but religion on that list we discuss in our classes. And even religion in the context of current events like the Islamic State, for example. I just finished the great debate with my American federal government students, and they use the Pew Ideology Survey. We do it at the beginning of the semester. I split them up into conservative, liberal, and independent groups, and give them 4 topics to debate on. And it's amazing. It just, every semester, it amazes them how much more they have in common than they have it differently or feel differently about. And so it's just an engaging project that, again, it forces them, right, to have those conversations with people who ideologically might be on within the same spectrum, but that look completely different, that maybe have completely different immigration status or different ethnicities or religious beliefs, etc. And again, they get to know each other in that way. And Professor Davenport and I have kind of had this conversation. I think maybe because we are in a community college environment and not maybe at a 4-year university, I don't really see my students as shrinking violets. I certainly have very boisterous and vocal students, and maybe that's because I encourage that on the first day. I tell them it's a safe space and not in that, Fox News, oh no, it's a safe space kind of way. We're all going to cry in a corner way. But it's a safe space for everyone to express their opinions because we're all adults, we're all open-minded, and there's not going to be any there's not going to be any canceling in my classroom over the expression of coherent, non-prejudiced opinions, right?
Right. And I think those of us that try to encourage that probably get a little bit more out of that when they know up front, hey, number one, I'm not going to criticize you for something you say. And I'm not going to let your classmates criticize you for something you say, which was the number one concern of students who did not, said that they were reluctant to speak, was that they were concerned that other students would criticize them either after class with other classmates or whatnot. And so they were reluctant to say something based on that. And I think, that's part of our job as professors is to create that environment that says, and listen, I've had students who said things that not only did I disagree with, but that I felt weren't said very well and could be very offensive.
Of course.
And there's a way to handle that.
Absolutely.
Right? There's a way to handle that allows that student to see themselves and what they said and how that might impact others, and to kind of redirect that before it devolves into kind of a very ugly situation, right? And so, not to say that in all situations we handle everything perfectly, but because it is messy. When you're dealing with human beings, guess what? It gets messy really fast.
Right.
But I think there is a way to manage those kind of discussions in which people feel comfortable expressing what they think. But they realize, and by interacting with other people, like you were talking about, having them work in these groups and whatnot, not only do they feel more comfortable speaking, they also become more reticent about saying things that they know would intentionally aggravate or upset those people, right? I know you now, and I have a relationship that I don't want to break because we've interacted and had positive interactions together.
And a lot of the time, and particularly, again, I think this particularly applies to the community college situation in a state like Oklahoma. A lot of the times, this is the first interaction that a lot of these students are having with persons of a different religion, persons of a different ethnicity, persons not from a rural area, etc.
That's right.
And so again, I think, they're coming at this at a very young age. And so if we can get that dialogue going sooner, hopefully this cancel culture thing will die out a little bit.
Yeah, I think, and we're probably about to segue into talking about Haidt's article a little bit here. But I think, with social media, it's like anything else. You have this period of time where we're figuring it out, and we are like children in a auto factory with a lot of tools that we shouldn't be handling, kind of a thing. And we figure it out as we go, and we also figure out now that we're more diverse as a society, and we're seeing that diversity emerge. We're figuring out how to manage that, how to interact with people who don't look like us, who don't act like us, and how to do so in productive ways. Right. And there's a learning curve there, right? Yeah. For a long time, we didn't have to deal with that. Now we do. Yeah. And so how do we do that in a productive way that makes everyone feel like they're a valued member of the community and who have something to contribute? And not ostracized because they're doing something that we wouldn't want to do.
Exactly. Right. So I like to tell my students I'm part of the Sesame Street generation. And I think there's been a very, swift, 180 that's been done since my generation started to come of age, right? So the Sesame Street generation, where we first learned that, little brown kids, little white kids, little Asian kids, kids that were being raised by their grandparents like myself, that it was okay, right, to socialize with these folks, etc. You didn't really have shows before Sesame Street that were, teaching children this sort of tolerance or, the normalization of diversity, if you will. I think that, and perfect segue into this new article, I think, unfortunately, because this generation is digital natives, they are just so equipped and so accustomed to that sort of veil of anonymity that social media provides them. So they are more willing to be vitriolic online rather than having those face-to-face conversations where they're going to be much more open-minded with that person who's different sitting in front of them. Yeah. I think, and unfortunately, that has bled into the adult populations as well, right? It just, social media has provided this vacuum, unfortunately, this echo chamber for a lot of folks, a majority of folks who do not want to hear other sides, to just reinforce their pre-established beliefs, and that only foments increased polarization across this country.
That's
and
right.
That's the rise of cancel culture.
Yes, right. We can't tolerate somebody expressing a viewpoint that we disagree with, and so we're going to go after them in some way, right?
So this article, I I saw the other morning on Morning Joe, which I watch while I'm putting on my makeup and usually have to redo because they're naturally talking about Ukraine every morning. So there was a great interview with Jonathan Haidt, who wrote this article in The Atlantic, and I recommend that you look at it, about how America has become uniquely stupid in the last 10 years and largely due to the influx of social media platforms. I really like, in one of the first pages, he quotes Federalist Paper number 10, which of course I know that.
As soon as he started that, I was like, you won me over.
Yeah.
You don't need to say anything.
I figured, right? So factionalism, this is the cancel culture, I think, even though we note that it's happening more so in the younger demographic, where it's happening in a bipartisan fashion, right? So in number 10, he really rails about the, factions, or the tendency for us to divide ourselves into teams or parties, and inflamed with, quote, mutual animosity, and that they are, quote, much more disposed to vex and oppress each other, right? We love this quote, rather than to cooperate for their common good. This is where we are in our politics, right? This is the kind of thing that leads to a January 6th, where we all have our own set of facts, our own set of actions to take based upon those facts, whether or not they're true. Right? I'm entitled to my own feelings, my own facts, and if they don't agree with yours, well, then you're canceled. And that is not what a democracy is. That is not what consensus is, right?
Yes, and I think one of the things I liked about Haidt's article was that it gives the evolution of this, right? This isn't something that just emerged in the last year or two. And he goes back a decade. You could probably go back even a little bit further than that.
My dissertation does. You can show
but it is very much this evolution of how we interact with each other, and how we drive ourselves into these little cocoons of like-minded folks. And ever more, our job is to defend us against whoever you are, right?
Exactly.
And there's no real communication going on between
at all,
right?
At all, unfortunately, right? So again, we have this sort of public distrust, and he goes even further into these, our distrust of the political institutions that we have now, and that simply creates again this idea that we're now canceling. Are we canceling democracy?
Right.
I mean, I don't know. Unfortunately, I'm not sure, and one of the more shocking statistics in here is him quoting the index that rates trust in political institutions. In the United States and a lot of other westernized democracies, such as South Korea, Great Britain, etc., rank extremely low. And this was in 2021 that they are doing this survey.
Meanwhile, some other
authoritarian,
were like high, right?
Yes.
And you're like, this seems backwards to me.
Exactly. And again, I think it breathes life into this idea that this factionalism and then this hyperpolarization has only led to the questioning of our future, generally speaking, as a society.
Yes. I think, this notion that I think is very real, that if we're not careful, it's very easy for democratic polities to break into these factions and become these warring groups. And you see it everywhere today, it seems like. I can't turn on social media without seeing it. I can't, sometimes I can't even go to the restaurant without seeing it. That you have these groups that are constantly competing for dominance, right? And it doesn't matter. There's no discussion of, is this the right thing to do? Is it, the only right thing to do is to defeat the other side.
Exactly. By any means necessary.
By any means necessary.
Right. Whether or not that's, calling for the hanging of a sitting vice president.
Right.
I'm sorry, continue to go back to this, but it's just, that's just the most visible, exactly. The most palpable example of how this can just spiral out of control. So in the article, he quotes Gurry, who is yet another kind of political sociologist. And I love that he notes the difference between the media apparatus, right? That shift between pre and post digital, where again, we have this centralization of information because we're all watching the moon landing together, right? We're watching and consuming these presidential debates together. We're all of these huge events, we're consuming all at the same time, and usually within the same, context, within the same narrative. But social media, as we said, allows these subfields, these different echo chambers to come about. Even within the same faction, you can have sub-factions that have their own particular opinion about the way things should go. And that, again, is extremely dangerous. This quote, I love from Gurry. The digital revolution, quote, has shattered that mirror, and now the public inhabits these broken pieces of glass. So the public isn't one thing. It's highly fragmented, and it's basically mutually hostile. It's mostly people yelling at each other and living in bubbles of one sort or another.
That's right.
If that doesn't just completely define the 21st century, I'm not sure what does.
One of the other things he mentioned in the article that I thought was, right on target was this notion that you have this kind of double-edged sword of social media. It allows voices that would not otherwise be heard to be heard, right? And so for a lot of groups, that's really important.
Yes.
But a lot of these groups also are the conspiracy theory groups, the fringe groups that all of a sudden their voices are magnified much further beyond what they would have been otherwise.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the downside of this. And unfortunately, it seems more and more those are the groups that are driving the train.
Yes. Right? One of the things I think he gets wrong in here, and really he's pointing back to Gurry's article in 2014, is that he notes that, these people in these factions, these, really hostile factions, they may be out there, they may be distributing their message, but they're not going to govern. And I wrote in huge letters, Marjorie Taylor Greene or Laura Boebert or
you're starting to see some of these folks get elected to office.
Yeah, and it's about a cult of personality. It's not as if they're actually interested in governing, right? It's about driving this culture, this cult that they have to the next election and to the next election.
That's right.
It's really devastating.
We're going to now use the levers of democracy to punish our enemies, right?
Yeah.
And
that's what Putin does, by the way.
Power over them, right? And that's my concern at the end of the day is for a democratic society to work, and I think the framers they understood this maybe better than we do today.
Definitely.
Which is democracy cannot just be whatever the 51% want rammed down the throats of the other 49%.
Yes.
Because all that's going to do is constantly set up this struggle for the control of that lever to be the one cramming stuff down the other person's throat, right? And so they did, and Haidt mentions this in his article, they did set up controls on democracy somewhat, regulators, if you will, to prevent it from just being run like a waterfall or something all over people.
Kind of distill it a little bit, slow down the process.
Exactly.
Anger.
And right now, nobody wants to really, and we look at this with, I think you can, politically, you can look this back to, reducing the filibuster on Supreme Court justices or other federal justices, right? And the gradual, what's that to do? Well, it just wants to let the party in control.
Exactly.
Ram somebody down the other side's throat.
And what's good for the goose is never good for the gander.
That's right. No, then we want to change the rules, and we want to make the rules favorable to us. The whole debate over gerrymandering is very much in that same kind of vein. We're going to take these technocratic tools that we have and design districts to favor us over the other side, irregardless of what it does to the political body at large, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I am concerned, and I wrote very plainly here, what is American civil society? Do we have a functioning one anymore? And the quote that inspired this is, when our public square is governed by mob dynamics, unrestrained by due process, we don't get justice or inclusion. We get a society that ignores context, proportionality, mercy, and truth. I mean, ... Where are we as an American civil society? If you don't have a functioning civil society that is, not controlled by the state, is divorced from that kind of partisan animosity, even if you want to have political parties within that civil society, that's totally fine. But it's a place, it's a public square for those citizens to have those hard conversations, to be able to come to consensus and not want to, insurrect each other when they can't. It concerns me because the civil society is such an important concept, right? And
it seemed like for periods of time in the 90s, in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of discussion about civil society.
Yes.
At least I remember that. And the need for these social institutions that are not governments and are not corporations driven by profit, right? But are all of the things that we have, Rotary clubs and chambers of commerce,
churches,
nonprofits, churches, all of these things that help foster social cooperation. And we're seeing these things break down because of that situation, right?
I argued in my dissertation that, the social capital, the building of political and social capital had transcended whenever we got to the digital age onto the internet. But unfortunately, I feel like that may no longer be true, in this society where, again, everything feels so fragmented. Right. Does that cooperation, does that coordination, does that consensus building actually translate online anymore? It did in the early 2000s to the mid 2000s, but I don't know about it anymore.
I don't see it anymore. I really don't. Efforts, and you know this as well as anyone. Any political figure that is seen as reaching out to the other side to build a bridge, they might find themselves unelected. They're going to get primaried, and they're not going to hold their office in the next time.
And again, it's just that fringe, angry group. I mean, we have so many different folks being primary.
And how many times have you seen where something that someone says, you take a 10-second clip or even a 5-second clip, and if you actually look at the larger thread, what they said in context isn't nearly as radical as what that 5-second clip makes it sound like. And I see people on the right and the left doing this all the time to people. It's like, look at what they said. Well, hold on, let's have a bigger picture and see what we're talking about.
Right.
But that doesn't fuel the narrative. That doesn't fuel that anger. And and it feels to me like that's all anyone's driven by right now is outrage. How much outrage can I stir up amongst my group?
Yep. And I think we got a little bit of that from our debate panel last week.
I think so.
They pretty much co-signed the anger electorate, if you will. I think, in the early 2000s, after September 11th, it was a lot of fear-based politics, right? Was kind of the trend there. But now we are what gets me fired up, what gets my base mad enough to show up and vote.
Right. It's not a pretty picture right now.
It's not.
And I don't know how... now, Haidt offered some ideas that we've discussed in previous episodes, right? To try to minimize. Do you want to talk about those real quick? Or, you know what? Let's save those for next one. This is going to be part 1 of 2.
Yes.
And we'll talk about some potential solutions to this problem. That will give us maybe a roadmap out of the mass that we're in right now.
It's a Not My Generation cliffhanger.
Woo!
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Love it.
All right. Well, thank you for watching with us. I am going off to go have a tooth pulled, so hopefully next time we show up, I'll be better.
Yes.
And we are glad you were here with us. We hope to hear feedback from you on what your thoughts are about cancel culture. And if you have any other ideas or suggestions or comments or criticisms, you can reach us at
notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.
And we will see you next time.